The whispers started the moment Frances Thompson stepped off the stagecoach in Fort Garland, Colorado. Her threadbare carpetbag clutched in both hands and her too pale skin marking her as someone who'd never seen a day of honest labor under the western sun. It was 1882, and the town was nothing more than a scattered collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vastness of the San Luis Valley, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. Frances stood there in the dusty street, her worn gray dress hanging loose on her thin frame, and felt every pair of eyes turned toward her with suspicion. The stagecoach driver tossed down her other bag without ceremony and drove off, leaving her standing alone in a cloud of dust. She was 22 years old and had nowhere else to go. Boston had rejected her, her family had disowned her, and the teaching position she'd been promised through a letter had turned out to be a cruel hoax. The schoolhouse didn't exist, and the name on the letter belonged to no one in Fort Garland. She'd spent her last dollar on the journey west, believing in a future that had turned to ash the moment she arrived. "You lost, miss." The voice came from a woman standing in the doorway of the general store, her arms crossed over her chest. She was perhaps 40, with hard lines around her mouth and eyes that had seen too much disappointment to trust easily. "I'm looking for the schoolhouse," Frances said, though her voice wavered. "I'm supposed to teach here." The woman's expression didn't soften. "Ain't no schoolhouse. Had one once, burned down 3 years back, never rebuilt it. Most folks around here can't read anyway, and they like it that way." She paused, looking Frances up and down. "You got family here?" "No, madam." "Money?" Frances felt her cheeks burn. "No." The woman shook her head slowly, and Frances saw something that might have been pity flicker across her face. "This town's got no use for another mouth to feed, especially one that can't pull her weight. You best get back on the next stage east." "There isn't one for 2 weeks," Frances whispered. "Then you got 2 weeks to find your way somewhere else," the woman said, and disappeared back into the store. Frances stood there, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not where everyone could see. She'd learned in Boston that tears only made people cruel, only proved what they already thought about girls like her. Girls who'd been born to a mother who wasn't married. Girls who'd grown up in the founding home with no name and no prospects. She picked up her bags and started walking, though she had no destination in mind. The main street was short, lined with a saloon, the general store, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of the harsh mountain sun. Men loitered outside the saloon, watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something darker. She kept her eyes down and kept walking. At the end of the street, where the buildings gave way to open land, she found a small church. It was barely more than a wooden box with a cross on top, but it looked peaceful. She sat down on the steps, set her bags beside her, and finally let herself feel the full weight of her despair. "You're the girl from the stage." Frances looked up to find a man standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and his eyes were a startling shade of gray that seemed to see right through her. "Yes," she said, straightening her spine. She wouldn't be pitied. "Heard you were expecting a teaching job. It seems I was misinformed." He nodded slowly, studying her face. "My name's James Crawford. I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Been running it alone since my father passed 2 years back." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I could use help. Cooking, cleaning, mending. The work's hard and the pay's modest, but you'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day." Frances stared at him. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're in trouble and you need help," James said simply. And I know I'm tired of living like a bachelor with nobody to talk to but cattle and horses." "People will talk," Francis said. "A woman living on a ranch with an unmarried man." "People are already talking about you," James pointed out. "At least this way you'll have food in your belly while they do it." He wasn't wrong. Francis looked at her bags, then back at this stranger who was offering her a lifeline when no one else would. "Why would you help me?" James was quiet for a moment. "My mother was an immigrant from Ireland, came here with nothing, and folks treated her like she was dirt on their boots. She died when I was 12, and I swore I'd never turn away someone who needed help, not when I had the means to give it." He met her eyes. "So what do you say, Miss Thompson? Will you come work for me?" Frances stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Mr. Crawford, I will." The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour in James's wagon, and Frances used the time to study her new employer. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was steady and calm. He told her about the ranch, how it had been his father's dream to build something lasting in this hard country, how the land was unforgiving but beautiful in its own way. "It's not much," he warned as they crested a small rise and the ranch came into view. "But it's honest work and honest living." Francis saw a modest cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that looked sturdy enough, and several corrals where horses grazed. The mountains rose behind it all, snow-capped even in summer, and the sky seemed endless. It was nothing like Boston with its narrow streets and crowded buildings. Here, there was space to breathe. The cabin was tidy but clearly the domain of a man who'd been living alone. Dust covered most surfaces, and the few dishes in the cupboard were mismatched. James showed her to a small room off the main living area, barely big enough for a narrow bed and a trunk, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains. "This was going to be a nursery," James said quietly. "My mother's room before that. It's yours now." "Thank you," Francis said and meant it. That night she cooked her first meal in the Crawford Ranch house. The supplies were basic, beans and salt pork and some withered vegetables, but she made do. James ate without complaint, though she could tell the food was plain at best. "It's good," he said when he'd finished. "Better than anything I've made in 2 years." Frances doubted that, but she appreciated the kindness. After dinner, she cleaned the dishes while James sat by the fire, reading an old newspaper. It felt strangely domestic, strangely comfortable, even though they were essentially strangers. "The town will talk," James said suddenly, not looking up from his paper. "Mrs. Henderson at the store, she'll make sure everyone knows you're here. They'll say things, ugly things probably. I want you to know you can stay as long as you need, regardless of what they say." "Why are you being so kind to me?" Francis asked, turning from the basin to look at him. James folded the paper and met her eyes. "Because kindness costs nothing, and it's the only thing that makes this hard life bearable." Sleep came hard that first night. Francis lay in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant cries of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods by the creek. She thought about Boston, about the founding home where she'd grown up, about the women there who'd told her she'd never amount to anything, never belong anywhere. Maybe they'd been right, but at least here, she had a chance to prove them wrong. The next morning, Frances woke before dawn to the sound of James moving around the cabin. By the time she emerged from her room, he was already dressed and heading out. "I'll be back for breakfast in an hour," he said. "Got to feed the horses and check the cattle." Frances set to work. She built up the fire, started coffee, and began making biscuits from the supplies she found. By the time James returned, the cabin smelled of fresh bread and bacon, and she'd managed to find some eggs in the hen house she'd discovered behind the barn. "Lord above," James said, standing in the doorway. I'd forgotten what a real breakfast looked like. They ate together in companionable silence, and then Frances spent the rest of the morning cleaning. She swept and scrubbed and organized, and by noon the cabin looked more like a home than it had in years. James came in for lunch and stopped short. "You didn't have to do all this. You gave me work," Frances said. "I intend to earn my keep." Over the next few weeks they fell into a rhythm. James worked the ranch from dawn until dark, and Frances kept the house, tended the garden she'd started, and learned to care for the chickens. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Frances learned that James had loved his parents deeply, that he'd never married because he'd been too busy keeping the ranch afloat after his father's death. He told her about his dreams of expanding the herd, of maybe raising horses instead of cattle, of building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. In turn, Frances found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. About growing up in the founding home, about the cruelty of the other children and the indifference of the matrons. About teaching herself to read by candlelight, about dreaming of a different life where she mattered to someone. "You matter here," James said one evening, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to know that." Frances felt something shift in her chest, something warm and frightening and wonderful all at once. She looked at James across the firelight and saw him truly for the first time, not as an employer or a benefactor, but as a man who saw her as she was and didn't turn away. A month after she'd arrived, Frances rode into town with James to buy supplies. She felt the stares immediately, heard the whispers that followed them down the street. Mrs. Henderson at the general store was coldly polite, but Frances saw the judgment in her eyes. "Heard you're staying out at the Crawford place," Mrs. Henderson said as she wrapped their purchases. "All alone with Mr. Crawford, no chaperone." "I'm his housekeeper," Frances said quietly. "That what they're calling it these days." The woman's voice dripped with disdain. James stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Mrs. Henderson, I'd thank you to keep your opinions to yourself. Miss Thompson is a respectable woman doing honest work." "For now," Mrs. Henderson said. "But we all know how these things end. She's not one of us, Mr. Crawford. Never will be. No family, no reputation, nothing but the charity you've foolishly given her. Mark my words, she'll bring you nothing but trouble." Frances felt her face burn with humiliation. She turned and walked out of the store, unable to bear another moment of the woman's scorn. James followed, carrying their supplies, his face dark with anger. "Don't listen to her," he said as they loaded the wagon. "She's a bitter woman who finds fault with everyone." "She's right, though," Frances said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere." James set down the sack he was holding and turned to face her fully. "That's not true, isn't it? I have no family, no history, nothing that would make me acceptable to these people. I'm just charity, just someone you took pity on." "No," James said firmly. "You're a woman who's worked harder in 1 month than most people do in a year. You've turned my house into a home. You've made me remember what it's like to have someone to talk to share a meal with, to laugh with." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "You've made me remember what it's like to be happy." Frances looked up at him, and in his gray eyes she saw something that made her heart race. "James, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you came here out of necessity, not choice, but I need you to know that you do belong, at least to me, if you want to." Before Frances could respond, a voice called out from across the street. "Crawford, that you?" James turned to see a group of ranchers standing outside the saloon. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, was waving him over. "Got business to discuss," the man called. "About water rights." James looked torn. "I need to handle this," he said to Frances. "Will you be all right here for a bit?" Frances nodded, still reeling from what he'd just said. James squeezed her hand briefly, then walked across the street to join the other ranchers. Frances stood by the wagon, trying to collect herself, when she heard footsteps behind her. "You're the girl staying at Crawford's ranch." Frances turned to find a young woman, perhaps her own age, with dark hair and kind eyes. Unlike Mrs. Henderson, this woman's expression held curiosity rather than judgment. "Yes," Frances said cautiously. "I'm Frances Thompson." "I'm Sarah Miller. My husband and I have a farm about 10 miles east of here." She smiled. "I heard what Mrs. Henderson said in there. Don't pay her any mind. She thinks she runs this town, but most folks just ignore her." "Thank you," Frances said, surprised by the kindness. "I know what it's like to be the outsider," Sarah continued. "I came here from Missouri 3 years ago, and Mrs. Henderson told everyone I'd never make it through one winter. Well, I'm still here," she laughed. "James Crawford is a good man, one of the best. If he's vouching for you, that's enough for most people." "Most people aren't very welcoming," Frances said. "They're cautious," Sarah corrected gently. "Life's hard out here and people protect what they have. But they'll come around once they see you're here to stay." "I don't know if I am," Frances admitted. "Staying, I mean." Sarah gave her a knowing look. "I saw the way he looked at you just now and the way you looked at him. I'd say you're staying." Frances felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, James returned from his meeting. He nodded politely to Sarah, who excused herself with a promise to visit the ranch soon. The ride home was quiet. Frances kept thinking about what James had said, about belonging to him. She'd never belonged to anyone, never been wanted for herself rather than what she could do. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. That night after dinner, James built up the fire and they sat in their usual spots. But the silence between them felt different, charged with unspoken words. "Frances," James said finally, "what I said in town earlier, I meant it, but I don't want you to feel obligated to stay if you don't want to be here." "Where else would I go?" Frances asked, then shook her head. "That came out wrong. What I mean is this is the first place I've ever felt." She struggled for the right word. "Safe. The first place that's felt like it could be home." "Then stay," James said. "Not as hired help, but as family. I know we're not related by blood, but families are built on more than that." Frances looked at him, this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who'd defended her against the town's gossip, who'd given her a chance when no one else would. "What are you saying, James?" He stood up and crossed to where she sat, then dropped to one knee. "I'm saying that in the past month, you've become more important to me than I ever thought possible. I'm saying that I wake up looking forward to seeing your smile, and I go to bed grateful that you're here. I'm saying that I love you, Frances Thompson, and I want to build a life with you, a real life, if you'll have me." Frances felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope." James took her hands in his. "Then hope. Hope with me. Marry me, Frances. Let me give you the home you've always deserved, the family you've always wanted." "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, James, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her, Frances felt something inside her finally settle into place. She was home. She belonged. Not to the town, not to Colorado, but to this man who saw her worth when no one else would. They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher who passed through Fort Garland. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church where Frances had first met James. Sarah Miller and her husband attended, along with a few of the ranchers who'd grown to respect James over the years. Mrs. Henderson didn't come, but Frances found she didn't care. She had James, and that was enough. The wedding night was tender and sweet, and Frances discovered that love could be gentle, that it could heal wounds she'd carried for years. James treated her like something precious, and for the first time in her life, Frances believed she truly was. Life settled into a new pattern. Frances was no longer just the housekeeper but the ranch wife, and she threw herself into the role with determination. She expanded the garden, learning from Sarah how to grow vegetables in the challenging mountain climate. She learned to preserve food for the winter, to make butter and cheese, to sew and mend with greater skill. But it was the ranch itself that captured her heart. James taught her to ride, and soon she was accompanying him on his rounds, learning about the cattle and the horses, understanding the rhythms of the land. She had a natural gift with the animals, a quiet patience that James admired. "You're a born rancher," he told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Better at this than I ever expected." "I like the work," Frances said. "I like building something that lasts, something real." That fall, they faced their first challenge as a married couple. A harsh early winter storm swept through the valley, catching everyone off guard. James and Frances worked together to bring the cattle down from the higher pastures, to secure the barn and the house against the wind and snow. For 3 days, the storm raged, and for 3 days they huddled in the cabin, keeping the fire burning and the animals fed. When the storm finally cleared, they emerged to find 2 feet of snow and several neighbors in desperate need of help. James immediately saddled up to ride to the nearest ranch, but Frances stopped him. "We go together," she said. "We're partners in this, remember?" James smiled and helped her onto her horse. Together, they rode through the snow, checking on neighbors, sharing their supplies, helping to dig out livestock. Frances worked as hard as any man, and slowly, the people of Fort Garland began to see her differently. "Your wife's got grit," one of the older ranchers told James as they worked to repair a damaged barn. "Didn't think an Eastern girl would last one winter out here, but she's proved me wrong." "She's proved a lot of people wrong," James said proudly. Christmas came, and Frances decorated the cabin with pine boughs and candles. She baked bread and cookies, filling the house with warmth and wonderful smells. On Christmas Eve, James surprised her with a gift, a beautiful shawl he'd ordered from Denver, the wool soft and warm. "It's perfect," Frances said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "But I didn't get you anything." "You gave me everything I ever wanted," James said, pulling her close. "A home filled with love, a partner to share my life with. That's more than any man deserves." Frances kissed him, and in that moment, she thought about the girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach 6 months earlier, lost and alone and convinced she'd never belong anywhere. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her place in the world. The new year brought new challenges and new joys. In February, Frances discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening after dinner, her hands trembling with excitement and fear. James's reaction was everything she'd hoped for. He swept her into his arms, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Frances asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," James said. "You've made me the luckiest man alive, James Crawford." The pregnancy was hard on Frances. The mountain altitude made her sick in the mornings, and as spring turned to summer, the heat became oppressive. But Sarah Miller visited regularly, bringing advice and encouragement, and James was endlessly patient, taking over the heavier chores and insisting Frances rest. In early September, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the next day, Frances gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, after James's father, and when Frances held him for the first time, she wept with the overwhelming realization that this tiny person was hers, truly and completely hers. "He's perfect," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at his son. Just like his mother, the baby changed everything and nothing. The work of the ranch continued, but now there was a cradle by the fire. Now there were tiny clothes hanging on the line. Now there was laughter and crying and all the beautiful chaos of a child. Frances discovered she was a natural mother, patient and loving, and James was besotted with his son. That winter was easier than the first had been. Frances was stronger now, more capable, and the neighbors who'd once scorned her began to stop by with gifts for the baby, with offers of help, with grudging respect. Even Mrs. Henderson softened slightly when she saw Frances in town with the baby, though she never quite managed a kind word. "Let her be bitter," Sarah said during one of her visits. "You've got what she never did, a loving husband and a beautiful family. That's worth more than her approval." Frances knew Sarah was right. She had everything she'd ever dreamed of and more. But there was still a part of her that wanted to prove she belonged, that she was as much a part of Fort Garland as anyone born there. The opportunity came in the spring of 1884. A family passing through town fell ill with fever, and the local doctor, such as he was, had his hands full with other patients. Frances, remembering the healing skills she'd learned from the matrons at the founding home, offered to help. She spent 3 weeks nursing the family back to health, leaving Thomas in Sarah's capable care and working day and night to break the fevers and keep the patients comfortable. When the last of them recovered, the grateful father spread the word through town about Frances's skill and dedication. After that, people began coming to her when they were sick or injured. Frances set aside a corner of the cabin as a makeshift clinic, stocking it with herbs and bandages and the limited medicines available. She never charged much, often accepting payment in goods or labor, and slowly but surely, she became an integral part of the community. "You've done it," James told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas play in the yard. "They don't see you as an outsider anymore. You're one of them now." "We did it," Frances corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you believing in me." James pulled her close. "I always believed in you. From the moment I saw you sitting on those church steps, I knew you were someone special." Life continued its steady march forward. Thomas grew into a bright, curious toddler with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, the herd growing, the land producing. Frances's healing work expanded, and James built her a proper clinic in a small building near the house. In the spring of 1886, Frances discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in December, she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after James's mother. The little girl had dark hair like her father and a fierce spirit that made them both laugh. "She's going to be a handful," James predicted, watching his daughter wave her tiny fists in the air. "Like mother, like daughter," Frances said with a smile. The years passed in a blur of work and love and growing children. Thomas learned to ride almost before he could walk, following his father around the ranch with devoted admiration. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's gift with healing, always wanting to help with the patients who came to the clinic. By 1890, the ranch was one of the most successful in the valley, and Frances was the most respected healer for 50 miles. She'd published several articles in medical journals, sharing her observations and techniques, and doctors from as far as Denver sometimes consulted with her on difficult cases. But it was the small moments Frances treasured most. The evenings on the porch with James, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The Sunday dinners with Sarah and her family, who'd become as close as blood relatives. The sound of her children's laughter filling the house. The feeling of James's arms around her at night, still as loving as they'd been the day they married. One afternoon in the summer of 1891, Frances rode into town alone. She needed supplies for the clinic, and James was busy with the haying. As she tied her horse outside the general store, she noticed a young woman standing by the stagecoach, looking lost and afraid, clutching a carpetbag in both hands. Frances felt a jolt of recognition. She'd been that woman once, standing in this exact spot, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She walked over to the girl, who couldn't have been more than 20. "Are you all right?" Frances asked gently. The girl looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. "I was promised a job at a dress shop, but it doesn't exist. The letter was a fake." Frances felt her heart clench with sympathy. "Do you have anywhere to go?" "No, madam. No family, no money. I spent everything I had getting here." Frances made a decision in that moment, one she knew James would support. "Can you sew?" "Yes, madam. Better than anything else I can do." "Good. The town needs a seamstress. There's a building behind my clinic that's not being used. You could set up shop there, and I'll help you get started." She smiled at the girl's stunned expression. "Everyone deserves a chance to belong somewhere. Fort Garland can be your somewhere if you'll let it." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most," Frances said simply. "Come on, I'll introduce you to some people who can help get you settled." As Frances led the girl down the street, she caught sight of her reflection in the store window. She hardly recognized herself. Gone was the frightened, thin woman who'd arrived 9 years earlier. In her place was someone strong and capable, someone who belonged. That evening she told James about the girl she'd helped. He listened with a smile, then pulled her into his arms. "You've got the biggest heart of anyone I know," he said. "It's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you." "Only 1,000, Frances teased. "Well, I'm still counting," James said and kissed her. The years continued to unfold with grace and purpose. Thomas grew into a fine young man, taking on more responsibility at the ranch. At 16, he was already talking about expanding into horse breeding, an idea James enthusiastically supported. Elizabeth, at 12, was apprenticing with her mother at the clinic, showing a natural aptitude for healing that made Frances proud. In 1893, Frances received a letter that shook her to her core. It was from a lawyer in Boston, informing her that one of the matrons from the founding home had passed away and left Frances a small inheritance. More shocking was the enclosed letter from the matron herself, written shortly before her death. The letter was an apology, a confession of regret for the harsh treatment Frances had endured as a child. The matron wrote that Frances had been one of the brightest children she'd ever known, and she'd often wondered what had become of her. Through some investigation, she'd learned about Frances's success as a healer and rancher's wife, and she wanted Frances to know that she'd made something beautiful of her life, despite the cruelty she'd suffered. Frances read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. James found her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter clutched in her hands. "What is it?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Frances told him, and when she finished, James pulled her close. "You deserved better than what they gave you," he said fiercely. "But you took that hurt and turned it into something good. You help people, you love people. You've built a family and a life that matters. That's the best revenge against anyone who ever doubted you." "It's not about revenge anymore," Frances said softly. "It's about knowing I was strong enough to survive it all and still choose kindness." The inheritance wasn't large, but it was enough for Frances to fund a proper school for Fort Garland. She donated the money and worked with the town council to hire a teacher and build a schoolhouse. When it opened in the fall of 1894, Frances stood with James and their children and felt a sense of completion she'd never expected. "You did it," James whispered in her ear. "You came here for a teaching job that didn't exist, and now you've given this whole town the chance to learn." "We did it," Frances said, squeezing his hand. "Everything good in my life exists because you believed in me first." The school thrived, and so did the town. Fort Garland was growing, becoming more than just a scattered collection of ranches and rough buildings. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of good land and a tight-knit community. Frances's clinic expanded, and she trained 2 assistants to help with the growing demand. Through it all, James remained her rock, her partner, her greatest love. They'd weathered storms, both literal and figurative, had built something lasting and true. Every evening they still sat together on the porch, watching the mountains and talking about their day, their dreams, their lives. In 1897, Thomas married a sweet girl from one of the neighboring ranches, and James and Frances became grandparents a year later when their grandson was born. Holding that tiny baby, Frances felt the circle of her life complete itself. She'd gone from unwanted child to grandmother, from outcast to beloved matriarch of a growing family. "You're crying," James said, finding her in the nursery with the baby one afternoon. "Happy tears," Frances assured him. "I'm thinking about how far we've come, how much we've built." James wrapped his arms around her from behind, the 2 of them looking down at their sleeping grandson. "We've built a legacy," he said. "Not just in land or cattle, but in love and family and community. That's what lasts, Frances. That's what matters." Elizabeth, at 17, announced she wanted to go to medical school. It was an ambitious dream for a young woman in 1898, but Frances and James supported her fully. They helped her apply to schools, and when she was accepted to a women's medical college in Pennsylvania, they threw her a celebration that the whole town attended. "I'm scared," Elizabeth confessed to her mother the night before she left. "What if I fail? What if I'm not smart enough?" Frances took her daughter's face in her hands. "You are brilliant and capable and strong. You come from a long line of women who survived impossible things and thrived anyway. You'll do more than succeed, sweetheart. You'll change the world." Elizabeth left for school, and the house felt emptier without her bright presence. But letters came regularly, full of excitement about her studies and the future she was building. Frances saved everyone, proud beyond measure of the woman her daughter was becoming. As the new century approached, Frances and James found themselves with more time to themselves than they'd had in years. Thomas was running most of the ranch operations now, and Frances's assistants handled much of the day-to-day clinic work. They took long rides through the mountains, revisited places that held memories, and simply enjoyed each other's company. "You have any regrets?" James asked her one evening as they sat watching the sunset, a ritual that had become sacred to them over 18 years of marriage. Frances thought about it carefully. "I regret the years of loneliness before I met you," she said finally. "But I can't wish them away because they made me who I am. They taught me to value kindness, to recognize love when I found it, to never take for granted what we've built here." "I don't have a single regret," James said, pulling her closer. "From the moment I saw you on those church steps, every decision I made led me closer to this life, this love. If I could go back and do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing." Frances kissed him, her heart full. "Neither would I." The turn of the century brought changes to Fort Garland and to their family. Elizabeth graduated from medical school with honors and returned home to take over the clinic, bringing with her modern techniques and equipment that made Frances proud. Thomas and his wife had 3 more children, filling the ranch with laughter and chaos. In 1903, James fell ill with pneumonia. Frances nursed him with all her skill and devotion, and Elizabeth worked alongside her, but for 2 terrifying weeks, they weren't sure he'd survive. Francis barely left his bedside, holding his hand through the fevers, talking to him even when he couldn't respond, refusing to let him go. "You don't get to leave me," she told him fiercely during one of the worst nights. "We made a promise, James Crawford. We build this life together and we're going to finish it together. Do you hear me? You're not allowed to leave." Whether it was her words, her nursing, or sheer stubborn will, James began to improve. Slowly, painfully, he fought his way back to health. When he was finally able to sit up and take solid food, the first thing he did was pull Francis into his arms. "I heard you," he said, his voice still weak but full of love. "Every word. You kept me here, Francis. You're the reason I'm still breathing." "I love you too much to let you go," Francis said, tears streaming down her face. "I need you too much." James recovered, though it took months before he was back to full strength. The illness changed him, made him slower, more careful. At 52, he was forced to acknowledge he wasn't as young as he used to be. But it also made him more grateful for every day, more present in each moment. They celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1903 with all their family gathered around. Thomas and his wife, their 4 children, Elizabeth and the young doctor she'd met at school and recently married, Sarah and her grown family, and dozens of friends from town and surrounding ranches. It was a testament to the life they'd built, the community they'd created. "20 years ago," James said in his toast, "I met a woman sitting on church steps, looking lost and alone. I offered her a job, but she gave me so much more. She gave me a home filled with love, children to carry on our legacy, and a partnership that's made every day of my life better. Francis, you took a lonely rancher and made him the richest man in Colorado. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Francis couldn't speak through her tears, but she didn't need to. Everyone in that room could see the love between them, could feel the strength of what they'd built together. The years continued their gentle march. James and Francis stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch and clinic, becoming advisors and grandparents rather than primary workers. They spent their days tending a smaller garden, taking slow rides through familiar trails, and spoiling their growing number of grandchildren. In 1908, Francis was asked to speak at a conference for rural healers in Denver. She was 68 years old and had been practicing her healing arts for nearly a quarter-century. Standing before a room full of doctors and healers, she told her story. How she'd come to Colorado with nothing, how she'd found love and purpose, how she'd learned healing from necessity and turned it into a calling. "They said I'd never belong," she told the assembled crowd. "They said an orphan girl from Boston with no family and no prospects would never make it in the harsh country. But I learned that belonging isn't about where you come from. It's about what you build, who you love, and how you serve. I belong to Colorado now, to Fort Garland, to my family and my community. Not because they accepted me, but because I chose to plant roots and grow where I was placed." The speech was published in several medical journals, and Francis received letters from women across the country, thanking her for showing them that it was possible to overcome a hard beginning and build a meaningful life. James, reading the letters with her one evening, smiled with pride. "You're famous," he teased. "I'm loved," Francis corrected. "That's better than famous." In 1910, they celebrated their 27th anniversary quietly, just the two of them. James was 70, Francis 68, and they'd earned their rest. They sat on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool mountain evening, and watched the stars come out. "Do you remember that first night?" James asked. "After I brought you here." "I remember lying in bed, terrified and hopeful in equal measure," Francis said. I remember thinking this might be my one chance at a real life. It was my chance too, James said. I just didn't know it yet. You saved me, Francis. From loneliness, from a half-lived life, from everything I was missing without knowing it. We saved each other, Francis said, lacing her fingers through his. That's what love does. It saves us from ourselves and shows us who we can become. They sat in comfortable silence. These two people who'd built a life together against all odds, who'd proven wrong everyone who'd said they couldn't, who'd created a legacy of love and service that would outlast them both. As the years passed into their 70s and then their 80s, James and Francis remained inseparable. They moved slower, spoke quieter, but the love between them never dimmed. Their family continued to grow and thrive around them. Thomas took over the ranch completely and expanded it into one of the most successful operations in southern Colorado. Elizabeth's clinic became renowned throughout the state, and she trained a new generation of healers in her mother's compassionate methods. In 1915, Fort Garland threw a celebration for James and Francis's 32nd anniversary. The whole town turned out, including people who traveled from as far as Denver to honor them. The mayor gave a speech about how Francis and James had helped build Fort Garland from a rough frontier town into a thriving community with a school, a proper clinic, and a reputation for welcoming those in need. 32 years ago, the mayor said, Francis Thompson stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag and broken dreams. James Crawford saw past what she didn't have and recognized what she did. Together, they've shown us all what's possible when we lead with kindness and love. This town wouldn't be what it is without them, and we're honored to call them our own. Francis, sitting beside James with his hand in hers, looked around at the faces of people she'd come to love. Children she'd helped bring into the world, people she'd healed, families she'd counseled through hard times. This was her legacy, not just her children and grandchildren, but this entire community that she'd helped nurture and grow. That night, lying in bed beside James, Francis said, I think I finally understand. Understand what? James asked, his voice drowsy. Why you helped me that day. You said your mother taught you about kindness, but it was more than that. You were lonely too. You were looking for someone to build a life with, even if you didn't know it yet. James was quiet for a moment. I'd forgotten what home felt like after my parents died. The ranch was just a place, just work. Then you came, and suddenly it was home again. You brought life back to these walls, to my heart. We found each other at exactly the right time, Francis said. We did, James agreed. And I'd find you in every lifetime, Francis Crawford. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Francis fell asleep that night feeling complete, feeling at peace with every choice she'd made, every hardship she'd endured. It had all led her here, to this man, to this life, to this moment of perfect contentment. The next few years were gentle ones. They watched their great-grandchildren being born, tiny miracles that connected them to a future they'd never see. They tended their garden together, James now moving slowly but still insisting on helping. They sat on their porch every evening without fail, watching the mountains they'd loved for over 3 decades. In the spring of 1918, James's health began to fail. He was 86 and had lived a full, rich life, but his body was finally giving out. Francis nursed him with the same fierce devotion she'd shown during his pneumonia 15 years earlier, but they both knew this was different. I'm not afraid, James told her one afternoon as they sat together in their bedroom. I've lived a blessed life. I've loved and been loved. I've seen my children grow and succeed. I've held my great-grandchildren. What more could any man ask for? More time, Francis said, her voice breaking. I want more time with you. "We've had 35 years," James said gently. "That's more than most people get." And Frances, every single day was a gift. "What am I supposed to do without you?" Frances asked, tears streaming down her face. James took her hand, his grip weak but steady. "You live. You love our family, you keep helping people, you keep being the remarkable woman you've always been." He smiled. "And you remember that I'll be waiting for you whenever you're ready to join me." James Crawford passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, Frances beside him, holding his hand. He was laid to rest on a hill overlooking the ranch, with the mountains he'd loved rising behind him. The funeral drew people from all over Colorado, a testament to the respect and love he'd earned over his lifetime. Frances grieved deeply, but she didn't break. She'd survived too much, built too much, to collapse now. She threw herself into helping Elizabeth at the clinic, into spoiling her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, into tending the garden that she and James had planted together. Every evening she sat on the porch alone, wrapped in the shawl James had given her that first Christmas, and watched the sunset. She talked to him, telling him about her day, about their family, about all the small moments he was missing. It comforted her to think he could hear her, that he was still somehow present in the mountains and the wind and the endless Colorado sky. Thomas worried about her, suggested she move in with him and his family, but Frances refused. "This is my home," she told him. "Your father built it for us. I'm not leaving it." And so she stayed, the matriarch of the Crawford family, the heart of Fort Garland. People still came to her for advice, for healing, for the wisdom she'd earned over 8 decades of living. She wrote letters to her children and grandchildren, sharing stories of James, of their life together, wanting to make sure future generations knew the love story that had started it all. In 1920, Frances was visited by a young woman researcher who was writing a book about women healers of the West. She spent a week at the ranch, interviewing Frances, documenting her techniques and her life story. "You've had an extraordinary life," the researcher said during their final interview. "Overcoming such a difficult childhood to become one of the most respected healers in Colorado, building a family and a legacy. How did you do it?" Frances thought about it carefully. "I didn't do it alone," she said finally. "I was given a chance by a good man who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself. He gave me a home where I could belong, and from that foundation of love and security, I was able to grow into who I was meant to be. Everything good in my life came from that one act of kindness." "So you're saying your husband made you who you are?" "No," Frances corrected gently. "I'm saying he gave me the space and support to become who I already was. There's a difference. James didn't change me. He just loved me enough that I felt safe being myself." The researcher's book was published in 1921, and Frances's story became known beyond Colorado. She received letters from women across the country, thanking her for proving that a hard start didn't have to mean a hard life, that love and determination could overcome almost anything. Frances turned 80 in 1922, and her family threw her a celebration that rivaled the one they'd held for her and James's anniversary. 4 generations of Crawfords gathered at the ranch, along with what seemed like half of Fort Garland. Frances sat in a place of honor, surrounded by the family she'd created, the community she'd helped build, and felt James's presence so strongly it was almost like he was beside her again. "I wish he was here," she told Thomas that evening. "He is," Thomas said, gesturing to the children playing in the yard, to the ranch stretching out around them. "He's in all of this, in everything you built together. That doesn't die, Mother. That's forever." Frances lived 4 more years, active and sharp until the very end. She continued to work at the clinic when she felt strong enough, continued to tend her garden, continued to sit on the porch every evening and talk to James. Her children and grandchildren visited often, and she delighted in watching the youngest great-grandchildren grow. In the fall of 1926, Frances fell ill with a fever. Elizabeth cared for her, but they both knew it was time. Frances was 86, the same age James had been when he died, and she was ready. "I've had a good life," she told Elizabeth on her last day. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. I've been loved, and I've loved in return. I've helped people, raised a family, built something that will last. That's all anyone can hope for." "You've been the best mother," Elizabeth said through her tears. "The best example of strength and kindness." "Then I've done my job," Frances said with a smile. She closed her eyes, and her last words were a whisper. "I'm coming, James. Wait for me." Frances Crawford passed away peacefully that evening, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was buried beside James on the hill overlooking the ranch, and the town of Fort Garland mourned the loss of one of its founding mothers. The ranch continued under Thomas's stewardship and eventually his sons. The clinic that Frances had started grew into a full hospital, with Elizabeth as its first chief of medicine. The school Frances had funded expanded, and a new wing was added in her honor. Her great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing stories of the woman who'd come to Colorado with nothing and built an empire of love and service. Years later, when historians wrote about the settlement of southern Colorado, they always mentioned Frances and James Crawford. Not because they'd been rich or famous, but because they'd embodied the best of what the West could be. They'd taken a harsh, unforgiving land and made it a home. They'd faced down prejudice and doubt and built something beautiful anyway. They'd proven that love and kindness were stronger than any hardship. In the Crawford family, passed down through generations, was a tradition. Every evening, as the sun set behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, whoever was living on the ranch would step out onto the porch and take a moment to watch. It was said to be Frances's tradition, started when she and James first built their life together, and continued until the day she died. The family kept it going, a small ritual that connected them to their past, to the love story that had started it all. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, those watching swore they could feel the presence of two souls who'd loved each other so much that not even death could truly separate them. The ranch house still stood, carefully maintained by the family, a testament to what James Crawford had built and what Frances had made into a true home. Visitors came from all over to see the place where one of Colorado's most beloved healers had lived and worked. They walked through the rooms where Frances had raised her children, examined the clinic where she'd treated thousands of patients, and stood on the porch where she and James had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. The story of Frances and James became a legend in Fort Garland, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. But at its heart was a simple truth. A lonely man had offered kindness to a desperate woman, and together they'd built something that lasted. Love had triumphed over adversity, hope had conquered despair, and two people who weren't supposed to belong had created a home where they both did, in the end. That was the legacy they left behind. Not land or money or fame, but proof that love could transform everything. That kindness was never wasted. That home wasn't a place but a feeling, built between two hearts that chose each other every single day. They said she'd never belong, but James Crawford built her a home where she did. And in doing so, they both found exactly where they were meant to be.